really glad to be here with you. And, when David and I did talk about what might be an interesting topic that'd be useful, particularly this year in our work. And that is, we did bring up this word about school culture. But I want to talk about it in very literal sense, actually, and realize that this word may feature in a lot of your guiding statements. But to step back for a minute and highlight really the importance that I see, the impact of your work in admissions to really shape and communicate school culture, but in a very specific way. And so let me explain. Invariably, because CIS is an international accrediting body, we will be contacted when schools face really serious challenges. I mean, actually, parents, teachers, students, leaders, if there are things not going well in schools, we are going to hear about it. And one of the things I think frequently that sometimes isn't understood is that we're not a regulatory body. We don't work on behalf of any government. In fact, we're completely independent. So in terms of regulations, I mean, probably the most serious step we could take would be, let's say, to withdraw accreditation. But realizing that accreditation is a completely voluntary process that a school community enters into willingly. So on one hand, when things go really wrong, and if a school is systematically breaching standards in our framework, they will lose accreditation if they don't demonstrate any will to change their practices or their approach. But the sad part of that is, and we have withdrawn accreditation in the past, just for sake of explanation to all of you. But the sad thing is that when we do that, we've lost any opportunity to help that school community move forward, haven't we? Because when we remove accreditation, we're also leaving the school and no longer in dialogue with the school. So in many ways, that's like our last resort. You would think, yes, if a school isn't performing well, it shouldn't be accredited. But if we're fully committed to a school improvement process, then we want to work with the school, showing the will and the capacity to move forward. And that's where I want to talk about this role of school culture, because invariably all of these disputes, no matter what they might be, let's say it's a contractual matter for a teacher. Let's say it was a head who was let go with no notice. Let's say it's a student who transferred to another school and there were questions about that transfer. Let's say it's a child protection case. Let's say that it's a board governance issue where the board has lost confidence in the head. Invariably, when you unravel the background or the underlying, what I'll call the root causes for any of these disputes, culture will come into play. For example, frequently when we go in and start a dialogue, when there's a falling apart between a school leader and a board, you will find that quite often there is a disconnect between one set of practices or norms and what the board might expect. And frequently, for example, throughout Europe, we may see a lot of schools, particularly expatriate schools. I don't know how many of you serve predominantly an expatriate community. Maybe raise your hand if you do. Yeah. And frequently what you'll see, if you look into the bylaws, you'll see that the school may have ages old guidelines about who can be the head of school. And quite frequently that will specify someone from a certain country or nationality. And then the board members, quite often from the local business community or parents, might frequently take the stance then of waiting out or riding out challenges with what they see to be an international hire. And they kind of dig in and think that we'll succeed longer than that person will. And what it is really, it isn't a breakdown in governance structures, it's a breakdown in culture, a cultural approach to decision making, let's say, here in Europe, versus, let's say, maybe more of a top-down decision-making style that might be preferred by someone from, let's say, the United States, for example. So frequently cultural, they don't need governance training, they actually need intercultural training. If we move to a child protection dispute that might arise in your school with a family that you've admitted, And all of a sudden people know, let's say that there's challenges going on with a young child in that family, but no one is talking about it. For example, if we get involved in, or it's reported to us that there's a child protection challenge going on that's not being addressed in the school community, quite often we'll find that the number one barrier to people reporting or even talking about that issue is, again, cultural norms that prevent the parent from wanting to talk about it, cultural norms that prevent the student from wanting to report it. So quite often going back to this issue of how do we do things around here? And that brings me back to the admissions office and some of the thinking that what a powerful role, what an educational role the office plays at the step that you're admitting a family, taking them into your community and trying to help them understand how decisions are going to be made, on what basis. And quite often the norms for those decisions are quite different across cultural lines. So the provocation that I wanted to ask of you today is to think about your role and what impact can you have in terms of shaping and communicating the culture, creating a greater understanding of how things are done in your school community. And do those families, do the parents and the student as they're entering, understand on what basis decisions are going to be made in the case there is a dispute of any sort. So that's what I'd like for us to talk about today and to consider that topic more broadly.
Jane, thank you. And I think you've really set up this conversation beautifully, in the sense that any one of us who've worked in admissions is going to resonate with that sense of the role of the admissions person as gatekeeper and preserver, not just of the school's finances, but also there's something about the people that come into the school change the school, and they change it for the better, and sometimes not. And maybe someone wants to kick off with some thoughts or ideas, something that was prompted, or an experience from their school, or
I'm wary of jumping in too early because I'm not an admissions professional, but
it is your birthday, Ewan.
Something that's frustrating me a little bit. Something that's frustrating me a little bit at the moment with some perceptions of accreditation. It's interesting that these are sometimes startup schools or schools looking for accreditation. And they think that just getting getting policies in place is going to be it, that doing the paperwork is going to be it. And they omit all the human effort that's required to actually bring people up to scratch. Case in point, and I can go, is going back a long time, going back maybe 6 or 7 years, but with the distance of time, I think it's probably easier to talk about. The child protection nonsense going on in international schools was an example of how the human side of what policy and what a school is about and how it communicates itself was completely missing. And it was all about having the paperwork in the right order, but not really thinking about whether it mattered. And so the guiding principles of the school were the same. The strategic plans were the same. People had checked off the box, but hadn't actually checked to see whether it was working on the ground. While in the state sector, state schools were outperforming the international school sector on all of those fronts, because they actually look at the child and they think about what's right for the child, and are we actually doing in practice everything that's required for it. So there's sometimes the paper game and there's what actually happens in practice, and they can be very different. In the best schools we work with, they're very closely related, and actually accreditation then becomes a natural part of our journey, talking about rethinking learning and teaching, but even talking about rethinking the approach to admissions and what you're promising parents when they're choosing a school or choosing an education institution. So it's maybe not entirely on point with what you're looking at, largely down to my lack of practice in your discipline, but that's what comes to mind for me.
I think the word, I'll just reiterate, the key word that came up is understanding, having a shared understanding of how things are going to be done, guidelines, norms for taking these decisions. And quite often, I think, and when we did make that breakthrough work with really putting a real careful light on child protection issues, you're right, Ewan, it wasn't just about putting policies in place. The first step was making sure all parents and all students understood, first of all, does everyone have a shared understanding of what child abuse is, and that if it happens, how we're going to deal with it in the school community. And quite honestly, that's an important conversation or even piece to really share and socialize with families coming into schools if they have different cultural expectations for how that's going to be dealt with.
It's such a hard sell, though. You don't really want to be talking about that if you're an admissions officer. Do you want to be talking about that stuff? You want to be upping the things that are positive. And I think that's why it can sometimes be, I don't know, David, that you had your open evening, and I thought the closest that we got to tricky conversations in an open evening where people were concerned about how the school might support a child with additional learning needs. But they assume that all the stuff that you look after, Jane, in accreditation, they assume that all the nuts and bolts are in place, rightly or wrongly. They assume it's all in place.
Yeah, love to hear your reaction about some of these hidden things that are pointing out. How would you, in your role, go about? What are the tools? What capacity? What tools do you have that you can use to help create a shared understanding right as a family joins a school community, without, as you said, having them run in the other direction? And on the other hand, if there is a good basis for decision making, how do you create the space to have those conversations?
I think for me, what this is taking me to a question about how the question of admissions and culture changes depending on the context. So when things are thriving, it seems to me that we as admissions people, and as schools, we take the position that everything's thriving. We may have waiting lists, and so therefore we can, in a sense, be more selective over families. And one of the things that we can be selective of is, do they actually believe in the product that we're selling? Do they believe that the way we encourage teaching and learning in our school, do they believe in it? Do they believe that a child should be exposed to Wi-Fi in the early years? Do they believe that we're not going to teach Latin in the secondary school, etc.? But what happens, I think, in times when enrollment goes down, is that it pushes us into something of an in-between, where on the one hand we have to fill the seats with somebody, and there are fewer and fewer of those people who necessarily believe what it is. And so in those moments, you have that tendency, and if you like, pressure to accept more people, but they don't necessarily believe in the things that we do about teaching and learning. And I think for me, that's when the moment at which school culture can significantly change. And it's making me think that we're going through such a period right now with COVID, where there's a lot of anxiety around school enrollment in different parts of the world, and whether that will be one of the things that we see on the back end of this is a shift in culture, because the customers that are now in our schools will inevitably change.
One thing I'm thinking of, I mean, when we say child abuse or neglect, it can mean so many different things. And just one thing that comes to mind in the admissions process that we talk about is the students' living arrangements. I know that's maybe sort of on the lower end of urgency for most students, but one thing that we explicitly talk about is that our students are expected to be living with their parents or legal guardians in Vienna, and that we expect the parents to be actively involved in school life and in their child's life. And having that conversation oftentimes sifts out some of the more dodgy living situations that are being proposed, like kids, staying in hostels or at some random family member's house while the parents are elsewhere in the world, or kids being raised by nannies rather than by their legal guardians. So that's one small way that we address it, right in the admissions conversation.
Mhm.
It's interesting you're saying that, because I've noticed, I'd say last six to 8 months or so, I've noticed an increase in applications from families who were looking for, I guess they're really looking for boarding, but because the kind of school that we are and schools they've been looking at that don't offer boarding, they're looking for some sort of strange living arrangements, and I've turned people down for that reason, because as you're saying, it's got to be part of the process, and it can be very difficult. And what David was saying before about families and the culture, I've also seen a number of families now where I felt the child actually does fit into the school culture, but the parents don't. And there seems to be quite a discrepancy between who you have on campus every day, but who also sort of moves around in the background and maybe causes or stirs things up from the parental side. And I guess you have to admit the whole family and not just the child.
Mm. I think of the schools I've taught in, though, and I never taught in an international school, only in some of the toughest schools in Scotland. You didn't have a choice, obviously, over who you had, and the school very much saw it as its responsibility to look after that. The cost is immense, because we have, probably on average, I would say 10 times more student counsellors, for example, whose full-time job is to look after not only the student but also the family situation. But it's really hard to predict which students need that support, and sometimes it's the bright kid from the seemingly bright house, and things change. Mum and dad separate, something goes wrong. As they say in French, that pété un câble, someone just goes for it, and suddenly things change. And teachers, actually, the biggest concern is how teachers pick up on that in the first place, in order to refer it on to a student counsellor. And I wonder whether there's an international school, if there's an ethic around accepting, it's hard to call yourself an inclusive school if you're making decisions about accepting a family or not, based on what you think, what you're judging to be an awkward living arrangement, for example. And so you can say, no, we're not going to take you because we don't think something's quite right. But the child's got to go somewhere. And actually, by not addressing it, the problem perpetuates, which makes international schools part of the problem.
So how do you figure out those issues? Where do you learn, or you mentioned Matthias, how did you figure out that there was a potential problem with that family?
The ones where the child doesn't live with the parents, it becomes pretty obvious during the process, obviously. And these are people I would not agree with what was said before, because these are people who don't live here. They are actually looking. They're like nomads. They're moving around, and they're trying to seek some sort of place for their child. You'd have to question why they don't find a school where they actually live. To send their child thousands of kilometers away to live with a distant relative or a guardian who they pay to look after the child, I think that's a lot more questionable. And I think I would see it the other way around. If international schools take those children, then we would actually fuel that sort of movement. So, and the other question it sometimes just becomes clear in an interview that parents are very clearly seeking this school for the very wrong reasons, and that they're not in line with what the school actually stands for and the values that the school promotes. But they might want the school to have, for them it might be more like going into a showroom and picking the most expensive car because it's got leather seats or something. But not, you can't always tell, but sometimes you can tell people show up for the wrong reason.
I think in admissions, this is the thing that I find more, that we have to be this filter and to make sure that what people say, it's actually to try to spot. And I have a recent example, because we had a family approaching us and they were against taking their child's temperature and wearing the masks. And this whole time, they were claiming that we are discriminating the child by forcing him to do this and to respect the rules and so on and so forth. So they were already recently enrolled in school. They're very new to our community and to our rules and but they knew how it was. So it was a very sensitive case, and I think it's something that we will encounter more in these times that we're living, because it goes to how they see it as a violation of their rights to behave in a certain way, and we see it as a way to protect the entire community and to, of course, obey the law in this case, because it's legal to do some things. So how to maybe manage this situation in a way that is aligned to your rules, and how to make your statements more clear, that this is why you do the things you do and this is what you believe in as a school and as a community. And I think this is a problem that we will see more and more.
So to David's point, you have norms, or you have guidelines, you even have codes of conduct, and I'm sure you have a lot of information you make available to the families, right? First of all, you don't know that they've read it all. There are things that you'll focus your interview on, right? Mm-hmm. But then how do you know that, as David was saying, the parent might still say, well, I don't believe any of that, but they still want their child to go to the school. So they still enroll them despite knowing that they don't agree with a set of, whether you call them rules, norms, or code of conduct that you've put forth. How do you figure that out? Or what are the opportunities to figure out if a parent is blatantly absorbed the information, disagrees with it, but moves forward knowing that they don't have any intention of following
them? I just think it's a lot of energy required, a lot of conversations, and a lot of people involved in the process, and reinforcing the rules that you might have not had the chance to address in admissions. As you said, we have other things that we focus on when we admit families, and then we end up realizing that we have major differences between the ways we see things, and we didn't have the chance to approach them in admissions. And then the educational team comes back to us and says, why is this family here? It has nothing to do with the way we do and see things, and it's this position that you're in, having to explain why is this family in a community. And I think it's a very difficult way to actually filter everything and to make sure that somebody that you let in the community is precisely the profile that you are looking for, or you're willing to let in.
I think for me, one of the things I'm reflecting on listening to this is almost there's whether we like it or not, there's kind of two models of school out there, and one of them might be we're a service provider, and we provide some kind of commodity, and therefore the responsibility, and this maybe links back to CIS, the responsibility for culture rests with the service provider. So they, make sure like a hotel lobby is nice and fresh and welcoming, and that's the culture. And then the second model is that it's not a commodity, but actually it's a community. And I think there's a kind of older, deeper model that underpins many schools, many international schools, is that this is not we're not simply service providers, we are a community. And I think that's inherent in being expats for many of us, largely expat, group of people who happen to be away from home in another country. And there it seems that if it's a community, the responsibility for culture is not just on the organization and administration, but it's actually on everyone. And it becomes a kind of we rather than you. And this is where I think in admissions, you've kind of got these two models wrestling. One is we're trying to sell you something, and that sense of the customer is always right. And the other side is you're joining a community, and you will take responsibility within that community for being a part of it, and so on. And I just wonder whether we're wrestling a bit between those two ways of thinking about school.
And another example I'm thinking of, which is sort of between the customer that we're trying to reach and the one that we're there to serve, is actually, for us, it's a U.S. Military family where we are, the responsible school for them, or the designated school. And I'm thinking of a case where the concern was about the frequency of moves and sort of the emotional toll that had on the student, who was then exhibiting some major behavior concerns at the previous school. And rather than saying, oh, this family doesn't fit here at our school, we did work out a plan with this family, a very detailed one, about setting up the student and the family for success, not just at our school, but also then knowing that they would move again in a year and a half. But it involved a lot of, it involved several conversations between myself and the family, between our director and myself and the family, setting up expectations and a conditional acceptance that would be achievable. Where at least from the school side, we could say we've put all of our ducks in a row to receive the student in a way that won't be nurturing to him, even though we don't know what's going on at home. I mean, those are aspects that in admissions we don't know and we can't necessarily influence, but we can walk into the situation with our eyes open.
I think it's really important that we help families understand what the expectations are at our schools, so that we're not necessarily giving them all the answers that they want to hear, but giving them the answers that are really true to our school, so that they will know and understand what they would be getting and what the expectations are if they join our communities. And I definitely think that in admissions, we see a lot of people. We're working with these families before they join our communities. We have the opportunity to observe them and notice when there are behaviors that are occurring that make us, kind of wonder about a parent's ability to partner with the school. And I definitely think that it's our then responsibility to make sure that conversations can happen with those families so that we can, work out together. And I love what Killian said about coming up with a plan for a student. Certainly that's the best thing, to really try and see what can we do to make this family's experience at our school a good one, or make the expectations clear from the beginning so that they can join our community in a positive way. But we have had the same, things that Matthias was describing of, family students where we're really worried about their living situation, and having to flag that even sometimes in doing re-enrollment. Things become apparent to us and families haven't communicated anything to counselors or teachers, but it becomes apparent to us that they intend to leave a child behind in the country and to move on to their next destination. And of course, we have real reservations about that and need to flag that up to our, child protection lead so that we can work with the family and try and find a solution.
I think a lot of it, I was in a great lecture last night, final lecture of a course that I've been doing. And the point that really resonated with me, because it's something that I don't think we ever write it down, but it's the things that you stand for. What is it you stand for? And your culture as an individual comes down to what you're prepared to stand for and what you're not prepared to stand for. So I have certain things that I do that for right or for wrong, there are certain things that I do and I choose to do them, and I write them down because that's the kind of weird person I am who writes down, this is a reminder to myself, this is the way you do things, do the right thing. Every time I've not followed it, I have royally screwed up and I've made terrible decisions and I've probably hurt a few people on the way. But every time I follow it, it's always worked out for the better. Institutionally, you need to arrive at those as well. And I think that what I've certainly been doing some work on with international schools is decision making as a cultural tool. If you can imagine what you do at the moment for one child, having all those conversations and setting up that plan is beautiful work, but it's incredibly intensive. And it's a lot of decision making, and every decision is a point where it can go wrong. Every decision is also a negotiation where someone is trying to win a point of view. You're trying to weigh something up. So by nature, your decisions are never 100% perfect because you're always weighing them up against things, negatives and positives. If you're having to reinvent every time the decision-making process that you're using to come to these massive decisions, you're introducing so much potential for error on the way as well. And this, when it comes to child protection, is one of many critical kind of issues. You don't want to be relying on whether someone's tired and just wants to get the issue off their desk so they can get on with their evening, or they don't know enough about the issue, they're missing some information. And so that's where decision making needs to be sped up. I've also been surprised at the number of boards who might feel it's their responsibility to get involved in something like that because they deem it serious enough for the board to participate. Other schools where it would be viewed entirely as an operational decision and absolutely not for an admissions officer to take, but rather a student counsellor, for example. So there's one of what's emerging for me in this is just a reminder of how awful most decision-making processes are in schools. And you can tell how awful they are by asking the boss in your schools to tell you what the process is for taking decisions on anything. And get yourself a cup of coffee because you're going to be there a long time.
Julia, you mentioned the word expectations several times, and I was just wondering, how do you make the expectations for parents joining your school clear, or how do you first introduce them? How would they know what those expectations are?
Well, things in a number of different ways, and it really depends on the family that you're dealing with, I think, and how in depth you go into different things. But of course, we have different guiding statements that we always talk about our school's mission. So that is always a part of our discussions with the family. But we also have a statement of community, which kind of outlines expectations and also some, consequences. So that is something that we'll talk to families about if we feel like there may be some challenges for them in that area and meeting our expectations. Those things are a part of our contracts and things like that. But whenever we're in doubt, we'll talk about those things more with the family.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy, but I think it's just really important to have those discussions with families because it's actually not fair to them. If they're looking for something different, you know, and we're expecting them to behave in a certain way. It's not fair if we know up front that that might be a challenge if we were to admit them. It's also not fair to our community because it then, you know, influences people in a negative way, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's really important then as you kind of create those expectations and socialize them. And then you mentioned even consequences. Like, I wonder how many experiences contributed to the development of those consequences that you choose to air, you know, at the admissions door.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, it sounds like things are terrible, but and like by and large, most of our parents and community members have absolutely no trouble, you know, meeting the expectations. But we have a few who've been particularly challenging, and so of course I think that has influenced, you know, how we're handling things up front in the admissions process. Because, you know, I can think of one family that we have still at our school who's a challenge, and we knew from the beginning they were going to be a challenge. You know, they didn't do anything really wrong or horrible, but we knew, and we should have had firmer discussions with them in the beginning. And yeah, I regret that we didn't.
What points were they around? Like, given it would be useful to hear the examples of what those problematic areas are.
It was, you know, more like an attitude towards things. So in the admissions process, they were always trying to just push the boundaries. You know, we have some requirements by Dutch law that we're required to give any Dutch students Dutch instruction in a certain age. And this family was just, you know, they're half Dutch, half American. And we explained to them this is a requirement for their family. And then they try and withdraw their Dutch passports and withdraw that information, saying, no, they're absolutely not Dutch. They don't need to follow Dutch lessons. And, you know, so some things like that. And the family always, you know, we're trying to schedule visits for them. They needed, like, you know, I think 5 visits, and, you know, and on different occasions for different things, and always very much at the last minute. We had to, you know, change everything around to meet their needs. And yeah, and they weren't always as respectful. And the way they, you know, communicated wasn't always polite, and things have just, with that particular family, gone downhill. And, you know, we've had to, we actually have this parent, one of this parents in this family, that is not permitted to communicate with teachers anymore because they were, so only the mother is able to communicate with the school now. The father has been banned from communicating with the school. So
yeah. Thanks, that's useful, helpful to understand.
Yeah.
It makes me think, Julia, one of the things that there's another difference out there. There are many schools around the world, particularly in national systems, where there's a kind of culture of segregation. The students in school and then the parents outside, and they never meet. And I think in international schools, we almost, again, maybe because of our history, we have that. We build community, we build connections with parents. We have parents, you know, within the school gate, and so there's a real upside to that in terms of that collaboration in the process of learning and the community spirit it builds. And I think many of us, what we will feel is that, you know, that there is a downside, and that downside is that sometimes that close juxtaposition with a family that doesn't really see eye to eye, or once they see what the learning looks like, realizes it's not what it was like when they were a child, and that's then spins into some kind of cycle of disappointment. I have a question of what was, and maybe for those people who've been doing this for a number of years, is it changing over time? Has it always been there, or are we seeing? Sometimes I wonder whether new generations of parents coming into school are choosing differently or having different expectations, and then that leads to shifts in culture because we're actually seeing kind of generational changes, or maybe it's always the same. I'm not sure the answer to that.
I'm not sure I do. I'm looking through it's kind of old stories of mine on this other screen, because there's so much of what you're talking about, which is little bits of meetings, board meetings, decisions, things that I've overheard and probably shouldn't have done. And you keep track of them. One of the things that comes to mind is the idea of decision making by consent, where you would, instead of reaching consensus, which is what you were talking about, Matthias, I think, where you're kind of bringing everyone together and trying to agree, that how would it change your role as an admissions person if you knew that you had decision making by consent, whereby you generally go with it and let things happen unless you feel it's going to destroy the business, which means you've got to have a really clear idea, again, of what you stand for as a school and what your business is. What is it your school stands for? What's the attitude? The core values would be a good example. We've worked with so many schools in core values. The process that we go through is valuable, not just for giving them really good text at the end. The process actually makes people believe in these values, that we stand for them, because they've helped create them. So the minute someone oversteps the mark, I've seen senior leaders in schools fired several times during the process of creating these core values, because it suddenly just becomes really clear that they stick it like a sore thumb and they shouldn't be there, because the school's decided this is what we stand for. Now, if you can do that with the school director or with senior leadership during a process like that, absolutely you can do it when you've got just the wrong fit for the school. And I think giving feedback to people saying we just don't think that your time here would be very successful because of our core values not quite fitting with what you're looking for, it's a very constructive thing. Send them to the competition, let them take on the pain of looking after these families rather than doing it yourself. But all I would say is, from an educator's perspective, you can't give up on the child. And if your school has something you stand for, which says that you believe in a growth mindset, that people can grow, learn, and change, if you are everyone included, for example, then you've got to stick by that. And by everyone included, that would mean that ISB doesn't have this conversation. It doesn't even figure, because everyone's included. And there would be a litmus test for a mission. Sorry, David, to put you on the spot.
Because if I think back, I think I can count over 16 years 2 or 3 families where we've actually selected the family negatively to say, look, we just don't think. I'll give you one example where I accepted the student and then telephoned the parents to say, as much as we would love to be able to welcome your son or daughter into the school, we're rejecting this application from you to be parents in the school. And it was simply a behavioral thing. So it was on the same grounds of the behavioral issues that would stop us accepting a child actually stopped us accepting a parent in that case.
Very good.
But I
think that's admirable.
And what was interesting about when we did it, of course, I was a bit nervous beforehand, but when we did it, the response of the parent was actually very positive. It wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a kind of negative aggression, how dare you? It was, okay, I'm going to think about that, and thank you for being honest. And who knows where they went? But I think it's. What it makes me think, though, as well, is that how often we assume when parents are joining the community, we do so much onboarding we do certain kinds of onboarding for parents, but the focus is on the student as soon as day one comes. And I wonder whether there is more to be done about actually helping families learn. Many of us are coping with huge turnover every 3-4 years. It's like a new school. and whether or not there's something there that would further support that culture just by having a program of learning about learning.
Yeah, a strong foundation is so important, isn't it? So you're really talking about building that sense, shared understanding for how things are done in the school community.
Yeah.
It was interesting. We had one person just recently was sharing a story about what did the family say coming into, it was actually a university admission decision, actually. They just said, the parent was really insistent, said, we just want to know for my child, what are 3 things that they really have to know so they fit in here? And the parent was just very literal. They just wanted to know. They were basically asking for the non-negotiable norms, if you know what I mean, one way or the other. And they just had an urgency for that list. I think in general, people do want to know. Sometimes they don't like what they hear. But ultimately, once you engage with what the expectations are, it can be so useful because you can't start to adapt until you actually know, well, what's it going to look like when I'm finally in, if you will. These are big challenges. But I think you each have a really influential, and I know so many times when things, sadly do go wrong, you can go back and say, wow, what opportunity do we have from the very, very beginning to build, make sure that these concepts are understood about, how we're going to act in certain situations.
I think another area, and we haven't touched on it, is that connection between culture and it used to be kind of the old-fashioned quota systems, because we believed that you needed diversity and you have to have a balanced kind of cross-section of nationality, and often it would be a quota set maybe on host national families or students. And then some schools have gone as far as various kinds of quotas to kind of create this balanced community. And I think very often underneath that is a kind of, in some ways, naivety around how diversity is built around what happens to be on your passport and whichever passport you choose to present when you first come to the school. Jane, I don't know whether you see that because you have that view across the world. Is that something that is still out there and growing and thriving, or are we seeing less of that kind of thing?
Yeah, less. I mean, there's no growth in the expat school sector unless it's really about franchising a really strong educational brand in a certain community. But I would go back just to pick up on what you were saying there about, again, that, essential understandings at the beginning. It's really, really important. I think going back to, that point of making a decision about a child joining a community, about, like you said, the whole family coming in, and especially when they're moving to a new community and struggling to settle in, frequently, you will see that there are so many assumptions made around culture. And I think I guess what I'm not saying very well, what I think the big point that we see over and over again is that by and large, international schools serving a diverse community spend a lot of time talking about, again, these norms and conforming, if you will, or similarities. But unfortunately, typically we err to that side versus we spend very little time talking about how we actually engage with difference. And that's very different. We use the word diversity all the time, but how do we actually engage when there are differences? And I think those 3 words we do all need to spend more time on, no matter what the makeup of the community, whether it's diverse staff with local population, whether it's expatriate staff, expatriate students, engaging with difference. And that's why these norms and shared understandings are really important, because ultimately it isn't all kumbaya and everybody gets along. And in fact, that's where I think the other trend we see now, particularly with the pandemic and racial injustice, that students are graduating from our schools and saying, you sheltered me, you made me think that everybody loves everybody and everything's good. And in fact, I went out in the world and that's not the way it is, and you didn't prepare me for that. So I think those are some big trends that we're seeing right now globally.